Okay, really good to see so many of you here. I think we're almost at full attendance, aren't we? Looking around. Okay, good that so many of you are here because today's lecture is particularly, in my view anyway, it's particularly interesting. And what we're doing today is we're looking at what are called labelling perspectives. Now, before we go on to look at this in any more detail, just want to mention a few things to kind of set the scene in a way. Most of the stuff that we've looked at so far, we can safely say are, broadly speaking, they are theoretical in approach. Now, some of you would have been aware of the fact that I've just called these labelling perspective. You kind of noticed that I use the word perspective and not theory. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason I'm saying that we're looking at labelling perspectives today as opposed to labelling theory is that really the difference between a theory and a perspective is usually that a perspective tends to be looser. Okay? So perspectives tend to be what we call a kind of a plurality of voices. So you find that there's lots of people that write in this kind of tradition. So it's not really a theory, it doesn't really have really kind of very clearly defined parameters. Okay, so it's a perspective, it's a, people kind of talk in this kind of tradition, they talk, there's a way of talking about kind of labelling. So it's not a theory, it's not really clearly delineated in the way that a theory is, it's just basically a plurality of voices. It doesn't represent then a homogeneous body of thought, okay, it's not very it's not certain in many ways, so you'll find that there are, if you like, nuances within it, it's very clear nuances. So there's labelling perspectives then. And really, because of what they actually say, there's a reason for that as well, but I'll talk about that at the end. Right, labelling perspectives then. Why is this so interesting? Why is this so important then? Well, it's interesting and important for a range of different reasons. You'll remember that a few weeks ago, right towards the start of the course, I gave you this example about the alien spacecraft, the car, and the traffic lights. Okay? And let's see if you remember. I've mentioned that 3 or 4 times, and let's see if you remember what this is about. What is this example for? Why did I use this? What does this illustrate? Anyone?
The two types of knowledge.
Who's speaking? I can't see. Thank you.
The two types.
Brilliant, excellent, you're a genius. Right, we said then that this example is being used to illustrate there are 2 forms of knowledge, aren't there? There's objective and there's subjective knowledge. Okay, 2 forms of objectives, 2 forms of knowledge, objective and subjective. And we said then that in terms of objective knowledge, this is something that macro sociology tends to try to reveal. Okay? Whereas micro sociology is more interested in revealing subjective forms of knowledge. Okay? So what's the example here then? What's the objective form of knowledge? So the example is, isn't it, that this alien spacecraft is hovering above this scenario and simply by observing, okay, by observing the pattern and recurrent nature of the fact that every time this car approaches a red traffic light, it will stop, when it goes green it will go. There's a form of knowledge there. What knowledge is there then?
Objective.
Sorry?
That's subjective.
Objective. It's objective knowledge because it's patterned and recurrent, and you can adduce that knowledge simply by observing this. Okay, but there's a limit to that, isn't there? So in order to reveal what's the subjective knowledge here then?
Why it's being done.
You speaking?
Why it's being done.
Right, the why, isn't it? The subjective. So in order to find out why this car is stopping, not simply that it is stopping, but why it's stopping, you would need to speak to the driver. And the driver will provide you with their subjective reasons for why they are stopping. So they're stopping because they've already got so many points on their licence and they don't want to get any more points. Okay? Right, now why am I mentioning this today then? Well, the reason I mention this today is because this is what we're doing today. For the first time, we're looking at a method, an approach, or a perspective that still seeks to reveal subjective forms of knowledge. Today we're looking at crime and deviancy from the perspective of offender themselves. Okay? Pretty much everything we've looked at up to this point then has been about kind of looking at crime, social forces. We look at sociological positivism, haven't we? That's what we've been doing so far. So we've been trying to rebuild these universal laws and applying those to a particular type of behaviour, in that case offending. So today then we're looking at the subjective then. We're looking at explanations that seek to describe offending behaviour, deviant and offending behaviour from the perspective of the offender themselves. Okay? So that's why this is so different then. You remember last week I mentioned to you that everything that we look at from this semester onwards then has one thing in common. Can anyone remember what that one thing in common is? What's the thing that I identified to you last week? Everything that we look at in this semester is going to be surrounded by one particular theme, and that is...
Oh, no, I was going to say against positivism.
Anti-positivistic in approach, or what's the word you just mentioned? Critical, right. Everything that we're looking at from this semester onwards then is going to be radical or critical in its approach. Because we said that everything we looked at before this semester is what we call kind of orthodox or kind of classical criminology. That's not, I don't mean classicism, I just mean classical or orthodox types of criminology. Everything we're looking at now then is radical. So what we're about to look at today then is very radical in its approach. Okay? So, this approach then, as a general starting point then, rejects the determinism of the approaches that we've looked at previously. Okay? So here then, the emphasis is on voluntarism. Okay, so they reject determinism and embrace voluntarism. So they understand giving explanations not as simply being out there, okay, but and kind of just existing. All we need to do is find these rules that explain, or these laws that explain why deviant behaviour. This approach seeks to reveal the meanings from the subjective actors themselves. Okay, so here then we're exploring the meanings held by the actors themselves. So this is already then appearing very, very different from everything we've looked at so far. Now, another recurring theme throughout the whole module then is that in order to understand the theory, or in order to understand the perspective, what is it useful for us to do?
Look at the context.
To look at the context, right. Why do we do that then? Why is it important to explore the context in which a theory or an idea emerges? What's the importance of context?
Because nothing actually happens in a vacuum.
Pardon?
Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Nothing happens in a vacuum. You're a genius, right? Context informs the theory or the perspective in this case, doesn't it? Understand the context will inform the perspective. It's a bit of a recurring theme throughout this module. Right, well, let's do that then. Let's explore the context in which labelling perspectives begin to emerge. Does anybody know?
Was it like 1950s, 1970s?
1960s, around about 1960s, broadly speaking. Yeah, a little bit before and also a little bit after, but broadly speaking, 1960s. Right, now in terms of socio-economic and political drivers, in terms of the context then, what was the context during this period? What is the context of the 1960s? Let's just try to bring out a couple of general themes. I know it was well before you were born, and believe it or not, it was actually well before I was born as well. But what was the context of the 60s? What do we associate the 60s with? Any thoughts?
Was there like a lot of social division between like in terms of politics?
There was social division, yeah. Think of some of the big movements. What were the big movements? What was happening during this period in the 1960s? What was the general flavour of the 1960s? Can you say something? No? Maybe stretching. Okay. But I'll tell you then. The 1960s is a period that is characterised by liberalism. It was a very liberal period. So in the 1960s, you had kind of swinging London, didn't you? You had like the kind of, the Beatles, really strong pop culture during this period. You had like, you know, it's literally the swinging 60s, you know, Carnaby Street was just down the road. You know, you had very, very distinctive youth cultures during this period. Kind of the sort of mobs and rockers were very, very clearly identifiable during this period. This was also a period of relative affluence for young people as well. Young people during this period had more affluence, more wealth than their parents could even ever imagine, and they had it when they were young. So you had a much kind of an extended and extenuated generation gap. So the older generation were looking down on the younger generation, thinking, well, you know, you've got all of this money, you've got all of this freedom. You had the great sexual liberation during this period, didn't you? You had contraception, female contraception. So this was a really liberal period then. It was an exciting period. You know, the big hippie movement was during, you know, love and peace, but there was also great social divisions. There were also great social protesting in America with the Vietnam War as well. You had the arms race as well, the Cold War. So this was a really exciting period, but it was a period of liberalism. But more importantly, it was also a period of empathy. Okay, there was a great deal of empathy during this period. So during this period, then we didn't tend to have the kind of values and attitudes that we have now about offenders and criminals. It was a more understanding period. So people wanted to understand what was going on around them. You know, people were politically active during this period as well. You had very, very clear politics with left and right-wing politics. You had, you know, the great kind of concerns about the insipid signs of communism. You know, communists were kind of extending their reach. So there was, you know, it was very, very clear in terms of politics as well. So this is a very, very defined period, but it was a period of liberalism and empathy. And it's on this backdrop then, it's this context that informs the perspective, particularly this, empathy. Here then, for the first time, we begin to get an attempt to try to understand the offending from the perspective of the offender themselves. Okay? More specifically, there was an attempt to try to seek to understand the social processes involved in becoming deviant. The social processes in becoming deviant. Right, so there's a recognition then that deviancy, crime and deviancy, was the product of a social process. There was a social process at play here then. And in particular, they wanted to understand how stigma was attached to individuals. Okay? Right, so there's some background then, okay, in terms of what drives this perspective. It's a period of great liberalism, a period of great empathy. So it's not then surprising, is it, given that context, that people are now starting to try to understand the meanings that offenders attach to criminality themselves. So what are the social processes involved in attaching stigma to individuals? Okay, right, so that's the backdrop there. Let's look at this in a bit more detail then. And the way they do this is actually very, very interesting in my view. So let me just explain what they do. Right, one of the pioneers of what's called symbolic interactionism. Right, let me explain what this is. Symbolic interactionism. Right, symbolic interactionism is basically the theoretical foundations for labeling perspectives. Okay? So we need to understand what symbolic interactionism is. Now, the pioneer of symbolic interactionism was this guy, George Herbert Mead. George Herbert Mead was the pioneer of symbolic interactionism. Now, in order to look at this, I need a volunteer. Can we have a volunteer? Who would like to be a volunteer? You'd like to be a volunteer, wouldn't you? You made the mistake of catching my eye, so you're my volunteer. Right, what's your name?
Salia.
Sania, I asked you earlier, what did it? Sania. Salia, right, Salia. Right, here's Salia. Okay. It's not a very accurate representation of what you look like, but this is what we'll go with. Right, Salia. Okay, now, according to George Herbert Mead, okay, you have the following. And we all have this, okay, this is what they say, not just Salia. But Salia has a concept of self. Okay? Now that concept of self is divided into a concept of I and a concept of me. Now, the concept of I is Salia's self-concept. Okay? That's how she sees herself. Okay? So her self-concept. So Salia, tell me, how do you see yourself? What is your self-concept? You can lie here if you like. You can say you're fantastic, brilliant, and excellent. Well, it may actually be the truth, I don't know. What's your self-concept? How do you see your... What are the values that you hold in yourself? When you close your eyes and you think, right, this is the essence of who I am, what sort of things come to mind? Any thoughts? I'm not putting you on the spot here. Just say a few things. Are you kind?
I'd like to think so.
Sorry?
I'd like to think so.
You're kind? You have a kind aura about you, right? Right, so you're kind. What else? It's interesting that you're asking these guys. You're basically saying, because it's actually quite, I mean, you're in a classroom, but people, it's a bit embarrassing really to ask you these things, but just think of some things that you would associate with yourself. So, kindness.
I don't know, easy to talk to.
Easy to talk to, so you're friendly. Just one more. Right now, what are you saying?
Stubborn.
Stubborn, right now that's interesting. We're going to ignore what she just said, you're stubborn, because what you're saying is this bit over here, right? I'll explain what we mean in a moment by this. Do you see yourself as stubborn?
Yeah.
Oh, fair enough, okay. And stubborn, okay, right, and you're stubborn. So you're friendly, kind and stubborn. Right, and there's loads of other values you have as well. But this is just some, right? So when you close your eyes, that's how you see yourself in terms of your self-concept. Now, your concept of me is your concept of self in a particular social situation. Okay, so at the moment then, so this is your role. Okay, so this is how you see yourself, your values that are internal to you, your concept of I. Your concept of me is your concept of self according to the role that you're currently in. What's your role? What role are you playing in this environment now?
Student.
You're a student, brilliant, right. So your current role is a student. About half an hour before you walked into this room, you had a different role, didn't you? Because you were actually travelling from wherever you lived to here. So your role there was the role of a commuter, yeah? So commuter. Right, and then before that, when you were at home, what's your role at home?
Daughter.
Daughter, okay. Do you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah. Yeah, so sibling.
So you have the role of a sister as well, yeah. Do you work?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have the role of an employee. Right, so you have all these different roles, okay. Now, according to George Herbert Mead then, we have concept of I and concept of me. Concept of I is your self-concept, your values, what you see inherent to your being, if you like. And you have a concept of me. Okay, this is your concept of self, but according to a particular social role. Let's just look at this. Is your concept of me different when you're a sister to, let's say, when you're a student?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. What's the essence of that difference then? What would you...
And then maturity levels.
Maturity levels? What's your... Which one are you more mature in?
No, as a student. Like,
well, you're more mature as a
yeah.
student. Okay, but you might say that, you know, if you've got younger brothers and sisters, they might see you as more mature.
Yeah.
Right, so in this situation then, there's a dynamic, because we're all playing roles here, aren't we? Because this applies to me as well. Whereas your role at the moment is one of student, my role here is one of lecturer. You know, 2 hours before I came here, my role was very different. So these roles are always shifting then, aren't they? Now, according to what George Herbert Mead says, is he says that over a period of time, okay, things may happen that will change our concept of self. Okay? So, Salia, let's have an example. You're actually quite punctual, aren't you, usually?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say that you're not then. Let's use that as an example. Okay, you're always late. Okay, you're always late. And your friends always know you're late as well. Okay, so when they're making arrangements to meet you at 9 o'clock, they rock up at like 9:15 because they know you're always going to be late. And likewise, I always recognise that you're being late. You always come into lectures late. You always come into seminars late. So what happens is that I begin, in this situation, and I am one of the primary definers, because I've got the power and the authority to attach labels to people. Okay? So I might attach a label to you that Salia is always late. Okay? So, in this particular role, what happens is that eventually, if we keep on attaching these labels, keep on attaching this stigma to you, because it's a negative thing, isn't it, to say to somebody always late. So it's a negative label, it's a negative label. If we keep on saying that, then what eventually happens is that this begins to affect what's called your master status. Okay, so your concept of self is your master status. So what happens is you begin to see yourself in terms of the label itself. So Salia's, one of Salia's values now becomes this, that she's always late. Okay? So it may not have been one of your original kind of values, one of your original sense of what your I is, but it becomes it. And what happens is that in these roles that you play, people begin to interact with you according to these labels that have been attached. Okay, is this making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so what you're doing is you're looking at the social processes involved in becoming deviant, the social processes involved in becoming delinquent. So how does this work then in terms of crime and criminality then? Well, let's use somebody else then. Let's use...
Let's use you.
Right, sorry?
Let's use you.
Huh?
Let's use you.
Let's choose me.
Yeah.
You can't choose me because I'm not delinquent.
We are.
Let's choose, this is a delinquent person, okay? This is somebody we're calling Little Johnny. Here's Little Johnny. Right, Little Johnny's in play school. He's only, how old are kids when they go to play school? 3? 3. Right, he's 3 years old. And he's in play school. And he's picking up all the other kids' toys and he's not playing nice, he's not giving their toys back. Okay, he's like hogging all the toys. So one of the nursery school teachers, one of the primary definers, they basically say to the other teachers, watch Little Johnny because he's going around taking all the other kids' toys. So what happens is that everyone's attention now shifts towards Little Johnny. Okay? So even if Johnny isn't really doing anything particularly naughty, because they're watching him, they're going to be more aware of what he's doing. So if he does sort of step out of line, they're going to basically say that he's naughty. Yeah? So what happens is that over a period of time, the primary definers begin to see Johnny as a delinquent. Not only do they see Johnny as a delinquent, but Johnny eventually takes on the label. And if people keep on saying I'm delinquent, then I will become delinquent. I am delinquent. I am delinquent. So they begin to see themselves in terms of the label. So it affects the master status of the individual. Okay, so then, they're looking at how stigma is attached to individuals and the effect that it has. Right, let me give you another example. If you wanted examples about me, I'll give you an example about me. Right, before anyone came into the lecture theatre this morning, okay, I took all my clothes off and I was running around the classroom with no clothes on. Okay? Nobody see it, but I was running around the classroom with no clothes on. I know you're about to vomit up your brick and Cocoa Pops, whatever it is. Now, is that an act of deviancy according to this approach?
Yeah.
Think about it. Think about what they're saying. Is that a deviant act? Me taking off my clothes and running around this classroom, but nobody's seen it.
No,
nobody saw it.
Nobody saw it. So why isn't that deviant then?
Because you didn't harm anyone, you didn't...
Does that have to be harm? It's not the harm.
You didn't upset anyone.
No one's identified it.
Nobody identified it. Because otherwise, if you say there's no harm, then all victimless crimes aren't crimes. Because, if you find smoking weed, you say there's no harm apart from myself. So therefore it's not victim, it's not a crime. Right, it's the observation then, isn't it? Somebody needs to see it. Somebody needs to, what's the real word? What's the correct word?
Observe.
Somebody needs to label it. Right. So, when I was running around the classroom earlier on with no clothes on, Salia came in and had to fright the life. Okay? So what happens then is that when her friends come in, she said, "You're not going to believe this." And they're like, "What's that? You're early, by the way." That's what they said. "You're early, you're not usually here this time." So they say, "You're not going to believe this." So like, you're a bit embarrassed about it, so you kind of write on a piece of paper and kind of pass it to your friend. You know, Mark Cambridge running around the classroom with no clothes on. It's all a bit embarrassing. Just don't tell anyone. So you being a sort of discretion, you then pass it on to your friend. So now there's kind of like Chinese whispers. Everyone knows about this now, okay? But I don't necessarily know that this is going on because I thought I got away with it. And then what happens is that you then begin to interact with me in terms of that labour as well. So I'm no longer Mark Cambridge, the criminologist. I am Mark Cambridge, the criminologist who takes his clothes off and runs around the classroom with no clothes on. So you begin to interact with me in terms of that label. Yeah? And this is what the labour perspectives are saying. And they're saying then that there are social processes involved in becoming delinquent. And we need to reveal those social processes. So they're showing then how individuals can become delinquent. And indeed, this approach is particularly useful at explaining how people become career criminals. How when you start committing crime, it's very difficult to stop. So people kind of, they become entrenched in their criminality. Not necessarily because that's what they want, but that's because of the social processes that are attached to becoming delinquent. So, do you remember I said this example of me running around the classroom with no clothes on? This guy here, no, he said there are what's called primary and secondary deviancy. Okay, most of you have done A-level in these ideas, pretty straightforward. Primary deviancy is deviant acts before they become labelled. Before they become labelled. Whereas secondary deviancy is where the act has become labelled as such. Okay, so that's kind of public recognition of it. And what happens is that, according to labour perspective, primary deviancy isn't really the main problem. The main problem is secondary deviancy, because from secondary deviancy, from secondary deviancy, you get what's called deviancy amplification. Deviancy amplification. So when people start to interact with me, according to me being Mark Cambridge, the person that takes his clothes off from around the classroom, you get an act of kind of deviancy amplification here. Not only will I begin to kind of repeat these actions, but other people do so as well. So you amplify the deviancy as a consequence of this. Okay, now, if I was to suddenly stop this lecture and go over here and pull out of this envelope a syringe, okay, and roll up my sleeve and inject myself in front of you, okay, would that be an act of deviancy?
No, it's not.
Who said yes? Why is that an act of deviancy in your view?
Because I'm able of doing deviant act. My eye doesn't have to.
But it's not just your eyes. What is it that I'm doing that's deviant? Why is that deviant?
Labels already eyes.
You don't know? Why is that deviant? I know why you're saying that. It's a bit of a trick question.
It's not
It's been labelled as deviant. What, me just putting an injection in my arm is deviant?
No, because you associate with drugs.
Because
You associate it with drugs.
you associate it. You didn't ask everyone what I was injecting. I might be diabetic. I might be injecting insulin. You just assumed that it was bad, didn't you? You're a bad man injecting heroin. Well, what these guys are saying, they're saying that no act is inherently deviant. It only becomes deviant when we label it as such. So the act of injecting in itself is not deviant. That's what they're saying. It only becomes deviant when we attach it, like you said. If you think that it's heroin, then it becomes deviant, doesn't it? So no act in itself then is inherently deviant. It only becomes deviant when we label acts as deviant. So the act of actually injecting heroin in itself is not deviant there. Because it may well be that I was injecting morphine. It may well be that I've got some kind of terminal disease and I'm injecting myself with heroin in order to act as a kind of morphine to act as a kind of a pain suppressor. So no act is inherently deviant, so no crime is inherently deviant. And that's what these guys are saying. They're saying it's only deviant when a label has been attached to it as such. So, we're looking at the subjective meanings here. Is this making sense? Well, now some of the stuff that's been written about this is particularly interesting. There's a guy called Gotham who wrote a book about asylums, mental asylums. And the book is really about how people become deviant, how the madness that inmates have is kind of reflected back onto them. Okay? So what he's doing is he's looking at what are called total institutions. So in this particular case, he's looking at asylums. But we can apply this, the principles of this, to prisons. So what happens when you're sent to prison? Well, first of all, then you're given once you've received a guilty verdict against you, the judge will say, "Take him down," or "Take her down." Okay, it's a classic statement, isn't it? You're taken down into the prison cells, and then you'll be allocated. You'll be sent to a prison where you'll be waiting to be allocated to a prison for a longer period of time. So you're sent to a prison then. Now, when you go into the prison, you get a series of what's called passages of status degradation. Okay, so you go through this process of status degradation, of kind of denunciation. So you'll go into the prison, you'll go into reception, what's called reception. Okay, and you'll see there's kind of like a line there, you have to stand behind the line. Okay, and all of a sudden, this whole process now kicks into play. Because what's going to happen now is your master status is going to be changed. Okay, that's the whole purpose of imprisonment in many ways, is to change that deviant identity. So, so when I go into prison there, okay, there's the line I'm standing in front. Okay, the first thing that I'll do, I'll make a mistake, and I'll call one of the prisoners, I'll speak to one of the prison officers, and I won't call them sir, okay, or boss. And so I'll get shouted at and told to, have a bit of respect and to call them sir. So already I'm thinking, oh, okay. And I probably won't turn out the line, and I'll step over the line. I'll get shouted at for doing that, so you go back. So already then you're feeling kind of, you're being denounced, really, your activities being denounced. Now, what happens is that your master status, your name, Mark Cambridge, is replaced. So you're now prisoner number WI348, for example. That's your new number. Okay, your old identity is totally stripped away. If you look around this room now, there's a lot of people in here that are wearing particular clothes because they want to have a particular identity, they want to present a particular identity. Well, my old identity is going to be stripped away, and I'm going to be given a standardised uniform with all the other prisoners. Okay, so I now have that element of identity taken away. The whole day, the whole routine then is going to be highly structured. I'm given standard equipment, standard things that everyone else has as well. Okay, so my old identity is taken away and it's replaced with a new identity, prisoner WI348, for example. Yeah. So what happens is then that Mark Cambridge there, he's found guilty. He goes to prison. Okay, and during that prison period, then your master status is changed. What's my master status now then? When I am in prison, I become a prisoner or an inmate, or a con, whatever term you want to use. Now, interestingly then, what happens, so that's before you're in prison, what happens after? What's my status, what's my master status upon release?
Ex-prisoner.
Ex-prisoner, excellent. Ex-con, right, ex-con, that's now my new identity. What are the implications of that for me?
It affects your whole life.
It affects
Everything.
It affects everything. You're absolutely right. It has far-reaching implications. It has far-reaching implications in terms of my relationships with pretty much everyone. It has implications in terms of my employment. So now you have to, and you have to do this for a number of years, declare if you have criminal convictions. So there'll be certain jobs I can't do. I can't become a police officer. There'll be certain jobs I can't do because of this. There'll be certain people that won't want to associate with me because I'm an ex-con. So according to this perspective then, what happens is that the process of incarceration actually makes the problem worse. Because rather than rehabilitating individuals, what it does is it just basically provides them with another deviant identity, ex-con. So you're mirroring the deviancy back onto the individual. So what you do then as a consequence is you create what's called spoiled identities. Spoiled identities. So what you're doing is you're imposing a new master role on the individual. Okay? Let me give you some more examples. Now, see, this is one of the strengths of this approach, is that we can really relate to this. I think even individually, but there are some really good examples of how this operates. It's a very persuasive approach of understanding deviancy. Has anybody read a book called A Sense of Freedom by a guy called Jimmy Boyle? Jimmy Boyle, everybody heard it? It was first published in 1977. It's not a chronology book, by the way. This is just basically an individual's own biography. Okay, it's basically their life story. Now, Jimmy Boyle was brought up in the Gorbals area of Glasgow, just after the Second World War. Now, for those of you that don't know, but during this period, the Gorbals area of Glasgow was particularly rough. It was characterised by poverty. It was a real kind of working class, rough area. A lot of the people that lived there worked in the steel industry. It was a really kind of rough, hardcore, working class, poor, deprived area. Everything you associate with poverty could be found in this area. It was also a very masculine area. You tend to associate that with these sort of things. And Jimmy Boyle was brought up in this environment. It was quite a violent environment as well. It's changed now. It's actually been redeveloped twice since then. But Jimmy Boyle was brought up in this environment where he saw his parents fighting. His father was quite violent. He would often see fights in the streets. So it was a violent area. Now, during Jimmy Boyle's childhood, he was exposed to this violence, as I say, and became kind of involved in minor acts of criminality. During his adolescence years, these minor acts of delinquency kind of picked up in frequency, and he ended up going into prison. He ended up coming out of prison, he ended up going back into prison, but then he ended up going into prison for a longer period of time. But the one key theme that characterised Jimmy Boyle's life was violence. Okay? He was a violent man. He witnessed violence and he administered violence as well. Now, when he was in prison, he built up this reputation of being Scotland's hardest prisoner. So this is something he wanted, this is something he kind of revelled in. Don't mess with me, I'm really, really tough, I'm really, really violent. Okay? Now, over a period of time, he became very, very disruptive, and he was sent to what's called the Barlini Special Unit. The Barlini Special Unit was a unit of Barlini prison for, I think it was about 12, it was only 12 prisoners, but it was Scotland's most violent, troublesome prisoners. They were all sent there together because, it's kind of, let's try and deal with the problem all in one place. And in this prison, they were given a relative degree of autonomy. They could choose what they wanted to eat, they could choose when they wanted to go to bed. So they gave him a little bit more kind of autonomy. And when he was in Barlini Special Unit with these other seriously violent offenders, troublesome and troubling characters, he started to take pottery classes. And the pottery teacher actually said, do you know what, Jimmy? You're actually quite talented. You actually have quite a talent here. So Jimmy Boyle got more and more interested in these pottery classes. And eventually, when he was released from prison, he became a self-employed artist. He became a pretty well-renowned artist as well. Now, what happened in that particular case is that for the first time in Jimmy Boyle's life, somebody had attached a positive label to him. Up until that point, no real positive labels had ever been attached to Jimmy Boyle. It was always negative, you're violent, you're a hard man, blah, blah, blah. And that had consequences because when he was walking around the land, he was in prison, oh, there's Jimmy Boyle, I'm going to have a go and see if I can make a name for myself. So people interacted with him in accordance with that negative label. But this was the first time that somebody had attached a positive label. So Jimmy Boyle takes on that label. He internalises that label and it becomes his master status. So when he's released from prison, there are kind of two identities here then. There is the spoiled identity, Jimmy Boyle, the hardened criminal, ex-convict, Scotland's hardest man, but there's also this positive label, Jimmy Boyle, the creative, world-renowned potter. So you've got two identities at play there. So this shows the power of labelling, it shows the power of the attachment of stigma. Because you know, when people do have labels attached to them, we interact with them accordingly, rightly or wrongly. Okay? So this approach then shows why there is in some cases some kind of permanency to offending behaviour. There's a process at play. And what we need to do then is to reveal these processes. So, in essence, they're basically saying there that stigma, the attachment of stigma, is the consequence of a social process. So, what we need to do then as criminologists is explore the processes that are involved in becoming deviant. So this means then that no individuals are inherently deviant, but we become deviant according to these social processes there. There's a social process involved in becoming deviant. Now interestingly, and this again we're coming full circle here now, we're going back to what we explored right at the very beginning in terms of context. What do you think? Just to get you to think about this for a moment. What do you think the policy might be that flows from this approach then? Because if you're saying then that attempts to control crime, so things like, you know, the more police officers you have, what would the implications be then for potential offenders? Well, the more police you have, you've got potentially more primary definers, yeah, which means you've got more people potentially coming into the system, which means then potentially you've got more people with spoiled identities. More people with spoiled identities means that they're kind of trapped in this framework of offending. Okay? So what do you think the implications might be in terms of criminal justice policy? How would you deal with this then, given this approach, what this approach says? Any thoughts?
Would it be like preemptive action, so getting to them when they're young, like at school, so if you know it's like a school that's had a history of having a lot of criminals, like when they're older, so you go to them and you sort of don't attach the label, I don't know, just sort of pick on rather than I sort of understand what you're saying. So you're saying that you preempt this then, that's what you're saying, is it? But what is it you're preempting? You're preempting negative label.
But then isn't that itself the problem?
No, so like instead of having teachers label them as bad, just get them involved in good things. So like instead of
so the attachment of positive labels to negative ones.
Like kids that are sent to the special referral units, instead of sending them there, try to get them involved more in that.
Right. You're absolutely right. So what you do is then you create the situation whereby you do not attach those negative labels in the first place. So you try to create more positive labels as opposed to creating negative labels. Once you start applying those negative labels, you begin to have a problem. And of course, this all works the opposite way as well. We're focusing on crime and deviancy. This operates on another level as well. There's a study done many, many years ago. Some of you might be familiar with this. Two new teachers were told different things about their classes. So they've gone into their class for the first time, and one teacher was told, your students, thick as pig shit, absolutely going to be a nightmare. They're not going to be very bright. They're really, really difficult. You know, beat them. And the other teacher was told, your class, geniuses, the lot of them, brilliant. You know, they are top of the class. You know, you've got the creme de la creme here. What do you think happened in terms of the results, in terms of the qualifications that these students came out with? Well, it reflected the expectations. The students that were told that they were dumb came out with really low qualifications. Those that were told they were really bright really achieved well. So if you attach the positive label, you create what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the same way that if you attach a negative label, that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. So you create these conditions. Okay, so this leads us on to thinking about some of the problems with this approach then, because at the moment, you know, we present this in a way that is very persuasive, but there are problems with this as an approach. Can anybody think of what they might be, of how some of the limitations for this? Anything jump into mind at the moment?
Are they over-deterministic on a person's behaviour?
Over-deterministic, yes, you're right. So you're saying then that what they're saying is once the label's been attached, it's almost as though you kind of, it's the deviant is on their back. You know, once it's basically been attached, that's it, there's nothing they can do about it. There is that kind of determinism about it. Well, if we go back to the example earlier on, we said to you that you were always late, didn't we? We said that, you know, so these guys, you know, whenever they meet you, they're like, oh, well, there's 9 o'clock, there's basically, there's real time, and then there's Sonia time as well, so it means like 15 minutes later. And then you can reject that label, you have the power to reject that, because what you always do is you're always early. You make sure you're on time, and you make sure, so you reject the label, you say, well, in actual fact, you know, that isn't me, that isn't the person that I am. But they basically say then that kind of you've got this poor innocent person kind of, you know, minding their own business, wandering around, and wham, all of a sudden this label's attached on them, and that's it. You know, there's nothing they can do about it. There is an element of over-determinism, isn't there? But at the same time, there is still something that's quite strong and persuasive about this approach. Now, there's probably one, in my view anyway, there are lots of problems with this as well. But you know, one of the key problems, and this links nicely onto what we're going to explore next week, one of the key problems with perspectives is this. Not just this, but just write these down and I'll explain it. Is that it's apolitical. It's apolitical. And it doesn't really consider the nature and quality of power relations. It doesn't actually ask who has the power to label, who's really doing the labelling, and what might their intentions be, what might their reasons for that be. And that's what we're going to be exploring next week when we begin to look at radical or what's called critical criminology. We're going to be looking at the fact that maybe there are groups in society that are much more powerful than others, and we need to explore the source of that power. Maybe the criminal law isn't this neutral instrument that we all think that it is. Maybe it's created by groups of individuals that want to protect their own interests, or that it just by virtue of the fact that it's created by particular groups, that it does serve their own interests. So what are the power relations that are at play in society? Why is it that the majority of people in prisons are poor? Why is it that the majority of people in prison are not just poor, but they're also the dispossessed, the most vulnerable in society? Can we draw something from that? Surely there's something meaningful that can be adduced.